Hello and welcome to Podcastodon. I'm Gecko Madsen.
And I'm Nick Bullshit. Alright, this is the Lesswrong Saga, Episode 1. And it was also clear that Potter was brilliant, and a whole lot more than just slightly mad, and playing a vast game that Potter himself mostly didn't understand, improvised at top speed with the subtlety of a rampaging Nundu. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, Chapter 7. Alright, where do I even start? In 2022, the cryptocurrency exchange service FTX collapsed. Its CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, was arrested and charged with a number of offenses, including securities fraud and money laundering. This was largely due to the sloppy and incompetent way the organization's books were run, and the fact that he transferred large quantities of money between FTX and his other company, Alameda Research, without properly disclosing it. These events attracted a huge amount of media coverage, which had the side effect of drawing attention to the ethical philosophy of effective altruism, or EA, that Bankman-Fried claimed to believe in. Lots of news outlets talked about EA, and they mostly did a good job of explaining what it is, but that's only one part of the story. No one seems to be talking about where EA comes from, and I think we should. The story I am about to tell is a hell of a thing. For a long time while researching this series, I struggled to find some kind of central thesis or through line, since there's just so much. This shit goes so deep that it can be hard to explain in simple terms what it even is. Then I read this comment on PhilosophyTube's video on EA. It's probably just me, but when I was watching the video, I thought the movement was just a way of thinking. I didn't realize it was a proper group. But that's the thing. It's not just you, Dragon Tamer 179. Thank you for phrasing the thing I'm trying to explain so clearly. In fact, effective altruism is just one piece of a larger movement. A movement I'm going to call the Effective Altruist and Rationalist movement, or EAR for short. What most people don't seem to realize, and what I hope to help people understand, is that this movement is a somewhat cohesive group. That its influence is broader than you might expect. And most importantly, that when you delve beneath the surface level stuff, it is deeply, deeply strange. There are at least 2 cults that have spawned off EAR, and we're going to talk about them in detail in future episodes. For a movement involved in important issues like AI ethics, I think this is something we should be worried about, or at the very least paying attention to. This movement is very complex, and most attempts I've seen to analyze it don't get into the deep stuff. Hell, now is as good a time as any to make a disclaimer. I've almost certainly missed important stuff. If you know about this community and you think I've gotten something wrong, please tell me. I'd also like to give credit to the giants whose shoulders I'm standing on. I'll mention my sources when I get to them, but in particular I want to shout out the blog Gradient Ascendant by John Evans. It's a fantastic history of this stuff, and it gave me a lot of good leads on research for this series.
There are more things on Heaven and Earth, Horatio, than dreamed of in all your philosophy.
Exactly.
That's what I intend to prove in this. I know nothing except that I want to prove that there are more things on Heaven and Earth, Horatio, than dreamed of in all your philosophy.
There are also more things in EAR than dreamed of in all your philosophy, apparently. When I research this community, I feel like that Lovecraft quote about Black Seas of Infinity. I'm standing on the shore of the Black Seas of Infinity, and I'm just looking out, and occasionally I see like a fishman poking his head above the water.
Fishman asking you to convert to Catholicism. Deep Lovecraft cuts.
There's just so much. I keep worrying that I've missed something huge because it's so easy to miss things. Because there is just so much. Another disclaimer. For those listening who are in the community or adjacent to it, I want to lay all my cards on the table up front. Ultimately, I think EAR does more harm than good. I do feel like I owe something to it because it produced some pieces of writing that helped me a lot during difficult times in my life, and I am going to call out the good things when we get to them, but for the most part the tone of this series is going to be critical, though there's a good chance that you already agree with a lot of my criticisms. If you support this community and you listen to this, thank you. But before we get into that stuff, I have to tell you a story. Part 1. The Methods of Rationality. A boy named Harry Potter discovers he's a wizard and goes to a school called Hogwarts where he learns to do magic, makes friends, and has a bunch of adventures. Except, Harry's adoptive father is a scientist, and Harry applies the analytical attitude he learned from his unusual upbringing to both the principles of magic and the unjust social structures of the wizarding world, making a large number of both friends and enemies in the process, and semi-intentionally throwing a wrench into the plans of all the major political forces in magical Britain. This is the premise of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, a fanfic I read in college. It's fantastic. It's an exercise in controlled chaos, a story of different characters, plots, and schemes bouncing off each other in incredibly entertaining ways, kind of reminiscent of the best parts of Death Note. It's very anime. Also a lot like a D&D campaign where the players refuse to take any of the DM's contrivances at face value. I think that's the thing I love most about this fanfic, how it completely goes against the spirit of its source material. Harry Potter is one of those stories that doesn't want you to think. It doesn't want you to think about the mechanics of how its world works or the ethics of anything in it. So when you drop a character who's inclined to critically examine things into the story, it kind of implodes. And it was really satisfying when I had only ever heard people talk about Harry Potter like it was the best thing ever, before J.K. Rowling went full turf in public that basically calls Rowling on all her bullshit. So after reading something like that, it's natural to wonder, who wrote this? And have they written anything else?
I have some quibbles.
Some quibbles.
Yes, I have some quibbles.
Okay.
For background, I also led part of HPMOR.
Yeah, that's the abbreviation for it. HPMOR, HPMOR.
It was not as revelatory for me when I read it, because I did not move in the same social circles that you did in which Harry Potter was inassailably good.
That might have contributed somewhat to my enjoyment of it. In my, friend group when I was a kid, Harry Potter was regarded as, this sort of untouchably amazing work of literature. And Harry Potter very much is not that.
I did enjoy it.
It's like Pokemon, right? It's one of those stories that really doesn't want you to think. And if you don't think, then it's good. Because, it very much does not want you to think about the ethics of how its world is set up. It's fine at first. I think those kinds of stories can be okay if you don't call too much attention to the fact that the world is fucked up. So, the universe of Star Wars is pretty fucked up. I mean, not even with, the Empire, but,
the whole droids thing.
The whole droids thing, that's fucked up. But in Star Wars, it's just, part of the background grime of the setting. And it's okay because they never try to justify it.
I think the fucked up bits in Star Wars are interesting.
From what I hear, Star Wars also kind of tried to examine that, but in a shitty way that didn't go anywhere.
It oddly comes up a lot in the first run of tie-in books, and then gets talked about less later. The early Star Wars comics feature a cyborg getting lynched for being a cyborg.
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem to write a story in a fucked up setting that has the conflict of the story not be about the fucked upness of the setting, if that makes sense. I don't think that there being sentient droids who are slaves, essentially, in Star Wars Episode 4, it makes it a bad movie. It's just this universe has this fucked up thing in it, and it's an interesting thing that you could think about, and it's not part of the conflict of the story, but the movie also doesn't really try to justify it. It doesn't try to say that this is good. There are lots of bad things about the Star Wars universe that never get resolved in Episode 4. Things just look kind of poorly maintained in a lot of places.
Yeah, a deep and abiding shittiness.
There's a deep abiding shittiness in Episode 4 at the very least. It's fine to write a story like that, and then people can analyze it and say, hey, this is fucked up. Also okay to have a story where there are fucked up things in the setting, and those do get analyzed in a way that is satisfying and makes a satisfying moral argument about why they're bad. So,
Data in Star Trek. At one point, his personhood goes on trial.
Oh yeah, it's making a moral argument there. If you take an aspect of the setting that raises moral questions, and then you sort of pick at those questions in an interesting way in the story, and then come to a satisfying conclusion that makes a coherent moral argument that is right, then that is also a fine thing to do in the story. What you shouldn't do is what Rowling did, where you have house elves and then have Hermione be portrayed as ridiculous for trying to organize a political movement for house elf rights.
No, the insane thing they did was have a racism metaphor about Muggleborns, and then also have a people that is supposed to be enslaved together in the same book.
Oh, yeah. That's also pretty weird. But anyway, so my point is Harry Potter is not this untouchably amazing work of literature that everybody I knew thought it was when I was a kid. Everybody has figured that out by now, but this fanfic made a lot of the same criticisms that people started making after Rowling went full TERF in public, but long before it became popular to criticize Rowling.
I found H. Pamor kind of smug.
Yeah, I know your whole thing about stuff that's quippy.
It's in love with its own cleverness. This is why I couldn't hang out with the super Hulock people. Also, I was a Percy Jackson kid.
Well, I was a Percy Jackson kid as well.
I preferred it because of the immediate physical violence involved and the patent unfairness of the setting.
I think that's the big difference, though. The setting of Harry Potter is also unfair. It's just that Percy Jackson doesn't try to justify its unfairness at all. It's more honest.
Yeah, the life of a hero is short and tragic, and the gods are not good.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're nice, but they're not good. Especially the first book. The first book was really fun.
I think the first book was the best.
It felt like places I'd been to.
There are a lot of people who really don't like this fic. It's very polarizing. I can definitely see why people don't like it, but it's satisfying to have somebody criticizing the nonsense of Harry Potter, and also just the ending of the tournament arc is so good. That's, I think, the best part of H. Pamor was the tournament arc.
I will take a resourceful idiot over a guy who's super intelligent as a protagonist any day of the week. Give me somebody who struggles.
The thing about H. Pamor Harry is that he does fail. People say he's like a Mary Sue, and I don't think you know what a Mary Sue is until you've actually read one. You know when you're reading a Mary Sue. It's very clear. But the interesting thing about H. Pamor Harry is that the first time I read through, it felt like, oh, this is just the author writing the character this way because he thinks it would be interesting. And then I learned more about Eliezer Yudkowsky, and I came to realize I think H. Pamor Harry is a lot more autobiographical of a character than I thought he was. So if you think his flaws feel contrived, then...
The bits where he fails, it feels like he was written in as he needs to struggle. The bit where Quirrell has him learn how to lose...
Oh yeah, that whole part was stupid.
Genuinely strange.
I'm not going to argue with you there. It's really the first, few chapters. I think the whole part where he's introducing Quirrell, he's kind of, figuring out what the fic is going to be, and I think it gets better after that. It gets better once it starts having arcs.
I would compare it to The Advocate, though, which is a deep cut for this podcast, in that there is just a fucking ineffable strangeness to the whole thing, where I can't quite get a read on what this guy's angle is. It's hard to pin down.
That's a good segue, because we're about to talk about him. Part 2, Into the Yudkowsky-verse. In 1996, a 17-year-old kid named Eliezer Yudkowsky joined a mailing list called the Extropians, which he probably found out about from a 1994 article in Wired. The article begins, "The handshake. Right hand out in front of you, fingers spread and pointing at the sky. Grasp the other person's right hand, intertwine fingers and close. Then shoot both hands upwards, straight up, all the way up, letting go at the top, whooping yo or hey or some such thing. You won't be able to do this without smiling, without laughing out loud. In fact, just try it. But this little ceremony, this tiny 2-second ritual, pretty much sums up the general Extropian approach. This is a philosophy of boundless expansion, of upward and outwardness, of fantastic superabundance." Incidentally, in the recommended section on Wired, next to the article, are the following links. Who's responsible for the Gaza hospital explosion? Here's why it's hard to know what's real. Amazon let its driver's urine be sold as an energy drink. Job hunting sucks. This programmer filled out 250 applications to find out why. A chatbot encouraged him to kill the queen. It's just the beginning. The 90s were a very different time, when people had a very different attitude toward technology in the future, and the Extropians completely embodied this attitude.
I want to specify that those were not from the 90s, those links. But they do resemble the game Deus Ex, which was made in the 90s.
Yeah, Deus Ex saw it coming. Deus Ex is fantastic.
I want to be J.C. Denton when I grow up, because he's able to navigate this shit.
The term extropian is derived from extropy, a term they coined to refer to the opposite of entropy. In the Extropian principles, they defined extropy as a measure of intelligence, information, energy, vitality, experience, diversity, opportunity, and capacity for growth, and Extropianism as the philosophy that seeks to increase extropy. Basically, they were optimistic techno-libertarians. An example of the sort of thing they talked about was cryonics, the idea of preserving human bodies at very cold temperatures until we figure out how to make people immortal, at which point they can be revived and live forever. The assumption being that we will eventually figure out how to make people immortal. The tone of this mailing list is dumb. It reminds me a bit of discussions I had at summer camp as a kid when somebody tried to tell me that special relativity said that, quote, energy equals time. This is not what it says. And that he thought Einstein was wrong because, quote, time is a human concept. So of course a cocky 17-year-old like Yudkowsky fit right in. He quickly became a prominent figure on the list.
I'm irrationally angry about people who say time is an illusion. I believe only in linear time, and anyone who disagrees with me is fucking certifiably insane and should be institutionalized.
Wow.
Time only goes one way and we all run out.
So there's a bullet point here in my notes that says, talk about the arrogant bastard thread. The basic gist of it is somebody is talking about singularity worship. This is getting a little bit ahead, but I'm going to read this part out. Basically, at some point in the future, Yudkowsky thought that we would build an AI that would figure out how to make itself smarter. The smarter it became, the faster it could increase its intelligence. Rinse and repeat, and you get a cascading explosion of intelligence, creating a being whose intellect is incomprehensibly vast. The AI would then be able to solve most of humanity's problems, to the point that Yudkowsky advocated not to worry about some of the problems of the present, because the AI could solve them much more easily. The important thing, he said, was to work on developing a self-improving AI as quickly as possible.
This is so fucked up in hindsight. The dramatic irony of the transformation that I know happens.
This is a literary technique known as foreshadowing. We'll get to it, but yes, there's some dramatic irony here.
And once again, we have to compare the 1990s to today.
Yeah. So the gist of the arrogant bastard thread is that somebody's talking about how there's too much singularity worship on the Extropians mailing list. How basically we should not assume that the singularity is going to fix all our problems. We should try to fix the problems of the present rather than worrying about developing a super intelligent AI that will solve everything, because that might not happen. We might not be able to do that. A couple of people respond to this and be like, yeah, we can't count on the singularity happening. We should try to fix present day problems. Somebody is saying, there is no heaven, there will be no singularity. We could create a wonderful post-human future where we'll be unshackled from many human limits, but it will take critical thinking, creativity, and hard work. And then Yudkowsky is like, don't accuse me of lying idle, and then lists all of the things he's been doing, which are mostly writing blog posts. After he's spent a lot of time trying to refute this singularity backlash, in the second to last paragraph he says, in conclusion, remember that I might not be right, but if I say you're wrong, you're almost certainly wrong. People are kind of amused by this. And then discussion goes on for a while, and Yudkowsky complains that people are personally attacking him. And then somebody responds with, Eliezer, I think you're a fine fellow, and if you have interpreted anything I said as a personal attack, I apologize. I assure you I did not intend it that way. I think some people are a bit put off by your arrogance, but not me. I like arrogant people. I'm an arrogant bastard myself, and it's always nice to talk to a fellow member of the Brotherhood. I look at it this way. If I have superior knowledge or intelligence, then I've earned the right to be arrogant, and if I've demonstrated exceptional stupidity or uncommon ignorance, then my arrogance performs an altruistic service by generating amusement and mirth in all I come in contact with. Which is honestly kind of based.
Oh god, you said based.
Sorry, it is based.
Much better.
And Yudkowsky responds with, working definition of the term arrogance. Self-righteousness manifesting as condescension and belief in one's own correctness. I try for a dry, unself-righteous recognition of when my theories are right, or, in an unrelated observation, when your theories are logically flawed. Working definition of bastard. A person who doesn't care when others are hurt. On occasion, I deem the truth to be more important than the feelings of others or myself, but that does not mean I don't care. Conclusion. I am not an arrogant bastard. I was right all along. You're totally off the wall, and idiots like you shouldn't meddle in the affairs of your intellectual superiors. The whole mailing list thought this was hilarious.
That's not as funny now as it was in the 90s. and I'm sad that it's not as funny now.
Yeah, so my point is, like many people, Eliezer Yudkowsky said a bunch of dumb things as a teenager. But also, he was really into the whole singularity thing, and he wrote a whole bunch of stuff. And this is not in my script, but I did read an autobiography that he wrote of himself, in which he unironically uses the phrase "my genius." So the arrogance is very real.
I can't believe Ross Scott did an interview with him.
Oh fuck, I didn't watch the Ross Scott interview. I need to watch the Ross Scott interview.
Well, we're gonna be doing this for a while. You have time. So, Ross Scott, a personal YouTube hero of mine, creator of Freeman's Mind and Ross's Game Dungeon, lovable enthusiast and global warming doomsayer, did a live interview with Eliezer Yudkowsky, for reference.
There's also another thing that wasn't in my script, but I think might be relevant. He talks a bit about how at the end of 7th grade, he lost the ability to handle school. He became really depressed as a kid, and I think later took Prozac for it. He had a bunch of mental health problems as a kid, and his parents kept trying to get him to do different things when he was depressed, and that made him even more miserable, and it really did not go well. And there's this quote here that I think is a genuinely good piece of writing, where he says, "I never hated my parents. They said they loved me, and the cultural wisdom of the science fictional literature said your parents genuinely love you no matter what you disagree about. The books I read showed parents who cared about their children, and the foolish, unwise children rejecting them out of anger. I believed in that scenario, and I refused to give in to it. People can love you and care about you and want what's best for you and still use their power to screw up your life and put you through hell. Behold the foundations of my morality. Sometimes awful things happen, and there isn't anyone you could rationally blame for it." I feel like this is going to become relevant later, but I don't know exactly where. But I wanted to read it because I think it is a good quote. There is some point in this saga at which I'm probably going to reference it again.
First of all, good quote. Second of all, I did not think that much about parents in science fiction until now.
Yeah. Yudkowsky got better at writing as he got older, but his penchant for weird ideas never went away. The most important one was the concept of singularity, which we already talked about.
Also, I always thought a singularity was when biology and technology become indistinguishable through cyborging.
There are many different versions of the technological singularity, but they all basically revolve around this concept of we hit a point at which growth becomes really, really fast, and so the future is going to look really, really different from present.
Okay.
The important thing to keep in mind from this phase is the concept of the AI version of the singularity, where we build an AI that can figure out how to make itself smarter that leads to this cascading intelligence explosion. Anyway, part 3, Effective Altruism. But elsewhere in the world, a different set of ideas about how to improve humanity were taking shape. That was my best Adam Curtis voice.
Are we going to Syria now?
No, we're not going to Syria. We're going first to Australia, but then to England. A huge amount of virtual ink has been spilled about effective altruism. In a stream after PhilosophyTube's video on the subject, she talked about how a friend told her that it's apparently all new philosophy students want to talk about. A previous draft of these notes said, "In the interests of not repeating too much that's already been said, I'll keep this explanation brief." It did not turn out to be brief. It's as brief as it can be while still laying the foundation for what we're going to talk about later. Effective altruism is a phrase whose meaning sounds pretty obvious at first blush. It basically means give lots of money to charities that work good. But there's more to it than that, and in order to explain that more, I want to talk about the history of the movement. I would argue a large part of the origin of effective altruism is in the 1971 essay Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer. If you've seen a YouTube video called The Most Controversial Ethics Paper Ever Written, as I have constantly, why will YouTube not stop recommending it to me, that's what this is. Singer's basic argument is that affluent people are morally obligated to donate money to humanitarian causes. If you have lots of money that you could use to relieve suffering at no real material cost to yourself, then you should probably do that, no matter how far away the person suffering is or how much connection you have to them. So at first glance, this idea seems reasonable, but I want to plant the seed of something here. If you're rich and you donate to a charity that gives food to starving people, who is deciding where that money goes? Who should decide where the money goes? Do you know how to help people better than they know how to help themselves? Anyway, in the latter half of the 2000s, this idea would start to gain traction and coalesce with a bunch of other related ideas about charitable giving. In 2006, some hedge fund managers in Connecticut formed a charity club to try to make informed decisions about which charities they should give money to. Two of them, Holden Karnofsky and Eli Hassenfield, liked this work so much that they decided to found a charity evaluation organization called GiveWell. This could be considered the birth of the effective part of effective altruism. GiveWell's reasoning is that if some charities work better than others, save more lives, reduce more suffering, etc. for the same amount of money, you should try to figure out which ones work the best and give to those. In 2007, both founders tried to promote GiveWell on various websites by using sock puppet accounts to ask questions about charities. This doesn't really matter, it's just extremely funny.
This is also something I would do.
My source for the stuff about GiveWell is a Huffington Post article that is very positive about them. A trend with all of this stuff is that whether it's EA or Rationalist or AI people or whatever...
By EA, we mean Effective Altruist and not the game company.
Whenever these people talk to the press, the coverage that they get is usually very positive and not critical at all, which is interesting. Also, the source for the thing about the sock puppet accounts is from the New York Times, which I'm going to mention because I'm going to briefly take a minute to complain about the New York Times' paywall. Because the New York Times, they have this paywall that says you get 3 free articles per week, but it doesn't work. It doesn't let you in even if you've read fewer than 3 articles that week. But you can get around it by using Reader View on Firefox. That's why I bring that up, because I'm probably going to link these in the description because I want to link my sources, and you can't read them without using the Reader View trick.
We've talked about this on an episode that got shelved. I'm a little annoyed we had to do it twice.
Look, I will bring up any chance to bash paywalls. Another important influence on modern EA is the philosopher William McCaskill. He advocates a couple of views that would become important in later EA. Number 1, long-termism. The idea that because there are many more potential future humans than present ones, we should be most concerned with decisions that affect the long-term future of humanity rather than the present. And 2, earning to give, the strategy of choosing a career to make as much money as possible in order to donate it to charity. I expected you to immediately have opinions on these concepts.
I was just waiting for you to finish.
Okay, I'll finish. McCaskill helped found the nonprofits Giving What We Can and 80,000 Hours, centered around these ideas. Giving What We Can members pledge to donate at least 10% of their income to effective charities, while 80,000 Hours provides free career advice for people trying to have the highest positive impact with their careers, taking into account the strategy of earning to give. By the early 2010s, these people were talking to each other. Peter Singer was a fan of both GiveWell and 80,000 Hours, as you can see in his TED Talk. So to sum up, we have the following ideas. If you have lots of money, you should donate it to charity. If you donate to charity, you should pick the charities that work the best, and you should make as much money as possible so you can donate it.
Marxists probably fucking hate these people.
Yes. Well, okay, so the obvious Marxist criticism of this idea is that charity doesn't solve underlying systemic problems, right? If you just buy mosquito nets for people, that doesn't fix the underlying problem of, like, the healthcare system in the country not being good. That's like the boring leftist critique. The more obvious critique is, how do you decide which charities work the best? Because not everyone shares William McCaskill's value of, like, long-termism. Not everybody considers potential future humans to have the same moral weight as people who are currently alive, even if there are way more of them than present-day people, right? So, which charities are most effective is kind of a matter of opinion. It's not necessarily an objective thing. Even if you are purely a utilitarian, it depends on how you weight different entities' moral considerations, right? Not everybody assigns the same, like, utility function to the universe, even within the philosophy of utilitarianism. And that's not getting into, like, other completely different ways of thinking about morality, like deontology. It's kind of weird that they treat effectiveness as some kind of, like, underlying property of a charity rather than a subjective thing. That was an awkward way to phrase that idea, but I think you probably understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I get it. I have a personal opinion about charities, because I believe that putting money into an economy will result in long-term benefit. I do believe you can solve some underlying problems by just flooding a region with basically US dollars.
I mean, that's what the Green Brothers are kind of trying to do, right? They have the whole Koidu Government Hospital project with Partners in Health. It's funded through charity, but they're trying to build up infrastructure. So, in a sense, they're kind of trying to fix the underlying systemic problems that are causing all of these issues in the first place.
This goes into an obscure piece of political thought, but the Social Credit Party of Canada, not to be confused with the Chinese social credit system, was based on the idea that there's a lack of economic growth in a society due to people not having enough money to buy stuff, which means that there's no incentive to do business there.
Yeah. Kind of like food deserts.
Yeah, so you give people money in order to make it profitable to try shit, and to have a fallback if trying shit fails.
Right, but you'll notice the difference there. They're not buying things for people, they're just giving them money, which I think is an important distinction, because if you just give somebody money, they can decide what they want to spend that on. Whereas if you just buy things for people, you can get that wrong, because probably people know what they need better than you do if you're, like, off in another country, right?
But that shit gets solved to some degree. If you look at, like, Nigeria or Ghana, where the big second-hand markets of charity clothing that's being resold, I'm in favor of that.
Oh, so you think, like, the people get things that they don't need, but they can set up a market to kind of fix that?
Well, if you're going to give people goods, they should resell them. Because you know what's better than a shirt? Cold, hard cash.
That's what I'm getting at, though, is like, if you buy something for somebody, right, you're making a decision for them compared to if you just gave them money. And I think that this is important.
It's all about social credit and distributism. So you're going to hear a lot of weird non-Marxist socialism from me doing. I may even verge into non-Marxist communism.
Okay, can you very briefly explain social credit and distributism?
The Canadian Social Credit Party advocated for a rudimentary form of basic income where you got a certain amount of money per year from the government in order to basically provide bottom-up economic stimulus.
Okay.
Put more money in circulation to make running a business more profitable, and also give people more incentive to entrepreneurship because they have a fallback.
Yeah.
Okay, and distributism is the idea of, instead of state ownership of property, or like concentrated private ownership of property, you have distributed private ownership of property, in which big things like corporations and factories and such are owned in shares by the people operating them.
So that's kind of like workers' co-ops or employee-owned companies.
It's the employee-owned company model. It was popular with, like, anti-capitalist conservatives.
Where?
Okay,
so this is like Tolkien-type stuff.
And various kinds of Spanish political radicals. So yeah,
that's our weird ethical philosophy.
Second thing. The other reason I think Marxists would hate this, it involves the kind of rich, educated person involved in business that Marxists hate. Saving the world.
Yeah, this is very much a rich person ideology, and it requires rich people to exist in order to make sense. You have to have disposable income, right?
Yeah, but having disposable income does not necessarily make you rich.
That's fair.
It's not a tech bro ideology, but an old school computer nerd ideology. And Marxists do not necessarily like old school computer nerds.
We will see that it also became a tech bro ideology. It has reach.
That's just because a bunch of old school computer nerds got money. That's how tech bros happened.
I don't know if you realize how deep a point that is.
There's a theme here about how much internet culture has changed, and so I'm trying to pull at that thread.
Alright, Part 4, the Singularity Institute. One place some of this EA money would end up going was the Singularity Institute. In 2000, Eliezer Yudkowsky co-founded the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, where he still works to this day. It's not entirely clear what he worked on back then, but at least one project was the essay Coding a Transhuman AI 2.0. I haven't read it in detail, but at first glance to me it seems very broad and abstract. Interestingly, the original version of the essay seems to have included something resembling an actual algorithm, which I'm kind of tempted to try and implement, just to see if I can produce a real program with it that actually does something.
This feels like finding a spell in an old tome.
In John Evans's blog posts about all of this stuff, which I'm drawing a lot on for this series, he points out how a lot of the things that Eliezer Yudkowsky has produced are theoretical, and he has not written very much actual code. He does know how to write code. He worked on like some kind of financial trading program before doing the Singularity Institute stuff. It's not that he can't write code, it's just that he's very much a theoretician and has not really produced very much practical work. And a lot of the theoretical stuff that I've seen of his is very vague. Algernon's Law is another example of this. It's an evolutionary psychology idea that he came up with that basically says that any like simple kind of increase in intelligence in the average human is not evolutionarily beneficial because they all come with downsides. I think that's the gist of what he was saying. Evolutionary psychology is already kind of a controversial field, but that's a tangent within a tangent. My point is that he describes this as a law and yet doesn't provide any systematic evidence, nor any suggestions for how it might be tested. He vaguely hints at that, but there's no rigorous empirical justification for this claim that requires extraordinary proof, and I would like to see more evidence for it, and he doesn't provide any. In my notes it says, in short, he just made this shit up, which may not be entirely fair, but it's kind of just speculation. Coming up with a hypothesis that sounds right means next to nothing in science. There are tons of hypotheses that sound perfectly reasonable and are even internally consistent but are just not true. The only way to actually know whether something is true is through real evidence, and there's no evidence here. That's kind of the vibe with Yudkowsky. In 2004, Eliezer's younger brother Yehuda, a student at Northwestern University, died in an incident on Interstate 94. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The death of his brother cemented Eliezer's belief in the importance of human immortality. Through cryonics and the project of transcendent AI, he continued to work at the Singularity Institute, eventually drawing funding from Silicon Valley big shot and notorious right libertarian Peter Thiel. To give an idea of what kind of person Peter Thiel is, he said in a 2009 blog post that he had become pessimistic about modern democracies because women and welfare beneficiaries wouldn't vote for libertarians. In the same post, he suggests that, quote, the vast reaches of outer space represent a limitless possibility for escape from world politics. In other words, he wants to escape to the last place not corrupted by socialism. Space! While working for the Singularity Institute, Yudkowsky started the website Lesswrong, dedicated to discussions of rationality, science, and AI. The oldest post I can find there is from 2003, but there are only 2 posts between then and 2006, when he really seems to have hit his stride, although it's possible the old posts were moved over from some other website. Lesswrong would become a place of congregation for people into the same things as him. Today there seem to be on the order of 500 posts per month. Another important thing to mention is that it was around this time that he started to switch from the super optimistic scenario about AI solving all of humanity's problems to a more pessimistic scenario around the possibility of AI doomsday, of this super intelligent AI wiping out humanity instead of solving all of humanity's problems, because it might not have the same sense of morality as a human. We're going to get into that more next episode, but there are some people, I think, who speculate that Eliezer's brother's death was partially responsible for his outlook turning more pessimistic, but the timeline doesn't line up correctly with that. He was talking about AI doomsday stuff, I think, before that, at least according to John Evans. I would have to double check that.
I'm skeptical of specific backstory elements totally explaining somebody's life.
Yeah. That's an important thing, is like, his brother died and he became depressed and thought that AI was going to destroy the world instead of save it.
And immortality was awesome.
Sounds like a better story, but it's not actually
it sounds
true.
Too good.
Yeah.
It's too satisfying.
Yeah.
To quote Citizen Kane, can one word really explain a man's entire life?
Yeah, no.
What was his first name, the brother?
Yehuda?
I don't think Yehuda is Yudkowsky's rosebud.
I do stand by what I said about it cementing his belief in the necessity of immortality, though. Much like Gilgamesh, he witnessed death and decided that he didn't want this to happen to him or anyone else. Unlike Gilgamesh, he didn't want it to happen to anyone else. Gilgamesh was just worried about himself.
I mean, he only cared about himself and Enkidu, and after Enkidu died, he only cared about himself.
Suffice it to say, Yudkowsky is not a fan of death.
Understandable.
Part 5. Synthesis. The less wrong stuff is important to mention because a lot of the less wrong people were and are also effective altruists. According to John Evans, the most obvious example is Luke Mullenhauser, a senior program officer at Open Philanthropy, who was MIRI's executive director for years. Editor's note, MIRI is the Singularity Institute. They changed their name. It's the same institute. But there's much more. For instance, Rebecca Barron, a grants assistant, attended an AI safety camp which counts MIRI's Evan Hubinger among its mentors. He in turn helps fund projects at the Long-Term Future Fund, which is managed by a team led by Asya Bergel, a program associate at Open Philanthropy, who previously worked at AI Impacts funded by MIRI. In 2019, that same LTFF fund, despite dissent, recommended a tiny donation to print copies of Yudkowsky's Harry Potter fanfic for Russian math medalists. This was recommended by Oliver Habrika, who has been Director of Strategy at the Center for Effective Altruism US and the project lead for Lesswrong 2.0, while apparently still dispersing funds for LTFF.
Wait, why are they printing it for Russians?
I don't know. I don't know why Russian math medalists specifically.
Okay, just checking. Though I could talk about Russia's weird and long-established fanfic tradition. Specifically Lord of the Rings fanfiction, though.
That's interesting. I didn't know that was a thing.
A lot of Russia's founding post-Cold War fantasy novels started as Lord of the Rings fanfics.
Interesting. That's some 50 Shades shit right there.
Only I kind of want to read some of these.
Yeah, I don't want to read 50 Shades, but these sound more interesting.
I would rather read Omegaverse fiction than 50 Shades.
Yeah.
Worst thing you can do in this world is be boring.
The LTFF fund recommended a donation to print copies of Yudkowsky's Harry Potter fanfic for Russian math medalists. What Harry Potter fanfic, you ask? In 2010, Yudkowsky began writing Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. He said, "I'd been reading a lot of Harry Potter fanfiction at the time the plot of H.P. spontaneously burped itself into existence inside my mind, so it came out as a Harry Potter story. If I had to rationalize it afterward, I'd say the Potterverse is a very rich environment for a curious thinker, and there's a large number of potential readers who would enter at least moderately familiar with the Harry Potter universe." He also used the fanfic's website to promote the Center for Applied Rationality, a nonprofit founded by some of his collaborators started in 2012. This is a name that will come up in future episodes. Conclusion. Full circle. Okay, so now we're back to where we started. A guy named Eliezer Yudkowsky is interested in AI, futurism, and rationality, founds an institute about it, gets a bunch of people together, gets money, and writes a Harry Potter fanfiction to promote his ideas. At the same time, a bunch of people decide that making lots of money and donating it to effective charities is a good idea, and the overlap between these two groups is pretty big. So you see, Dragon Tamer 179, not only is EA a proper group, it's part of a larger group of futurists, techno-libertarians, extropians. Perhaps lunatics is the best word. So far, this has been the tame end of all this stuff. I mean, the Singularity Institute took Peter Thiel money, which is sus, and the entire philosophy of EA has some deep flaws. But this stuff is within the realm of, semi-mundane nonsense. How do we get from this to cults, monarchists, and psychotic breaks? Join us next month as we dive beneath the surface and discover just how big this iceberg really is.
I have one question. Does the phrase Dark Enlightenment show up?
No. But it can if you want to. So the connection to the Dark Enlightenment is through Peter Thiel, basically, and his sort of cohort.
Because you said monarchists.
Oh, that's true. No. Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about that.
I was going to say the Dark Enlightenment people. You know how you have to do battle with a copy of yourself?
What?
I've talked about how I believe in magic. One of the most important things on your magical journey is to do battle with a version of yourself.
Do you think that the Dark Enlightenment people are your version of yourself that you have to do battle with?
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll do that at some point in future episodes.
All right, let's end it here.
Do you have any closing thoughts?
I've been Gecko Madsen.
And I've been Nick Bullshit.
And I don't have any closing thoughts.
This has been the Podcastodon. There are over 6 million podcasts in the world. Thank you for listening to this one. It sounds good, and if it sounds good, then it is good.